You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be with you on another day. It's a cold, snowy day here in Utah. Nothing too great. It's one of those wonderful March snowstorms, and traditionally I just let the snow melt, right? Like I don't go shovel. It usually gets warm by the end of the day, and we're fine. Not today. It's a cold day. So happy to be back with you, as I've mentioned. I got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. Obviously, Alex Jensen was introduced to the media and the public yesterday, so we'll touch on that and talk about a little bit spring football and stuff like that. But before we do, let me tell you about our partners, U First Credit Union. With your U First Rewards checking account, you can earn monthly reward points for buying something special for your best friend. Then you can redeem your reward points for something special for yourself. And with no monthly maintenance fees plus free ID theft protection, you can love that the U First Rewards checking is big on perks and peace of mind. Put your checking account to work for you so you can spend more time doing more rewarding things. It's easy rewards checking with U First Credit Union. Check out the full details at ufirstcu.com. All right, let's get some housekeeping things out of the way, right? Obviously, Alex Jensen was introduced yesterday, and I'll talk about that. But we'll get a few things out of the way real briefly, and then we'll get into that kind of stuff. And so, first off, the women's basketball team made it to the NCAA tournament. They are an 8 seed going up against number 9 Indiana. Tough meeting. This is a team that kind of resembles themselves in the mirror. Utah has struggled at times when they face teams similar to them. But this is a team that, you know, if Utah can just play their own game and not allow the other team to kind of dictate the tone and the tempo of the game, Utah usually does okay. They usually get their shots to fall. It's not often that they don't have a great scoring night, but it happens, as we saw in the Big 12 tournament. So, you know, this is a team that's dependent, obviously, on that shooting, but they just have to be aggressive, right? Like these last week and a half or so, Gavin Peterson, you know, he's working on trying to get them to be more aggressive, be more consistent, that kind of stuff, where when the scoring doesn't happen, you've got to find your way to be able to impact the game more, you know, do something different, find ways to be able to get yourself involved. So it's just trying to fine-tune those things as you get into the NCAA tournament. But this draw is tough for the women. They get, as I mentioned, Indiana, that dreaded 8-9 matchup where anything can happen. You know, you're playing a team that is pretty similar to yourself. This game will be played on March 21st, so Friday at 11:30 a.m. on ESPN2. And if they do get the win, your meeting is most likely with number 1 South Carolina. I can't imagine a world where South Carolina doesn't win that first-round matchup. In women's basketball, you don't see as many upsets, especially from that high of seeding. You know, and so it's pretty chalk in terms of how that bracket goes. But Utah will get another date with South Carolina, assuming that they win. And you know, there is an advantage in the sense that you've competed against them in the last year or so, and so there's some tape out there to understand what you did. But that was at a neutral site. This is at at their home. They're the reigning champions. I mean, this is excuse me. This is March, and you know, they're focused on being able to get back to another championship game. So really tough draw for Utah. Obviously, if you can beat South Carolina, things open up a little bit for you, and things can be much better, get to that Sweet 16. But this is arguably the toughest path that Utah could have got. You know, there was a lot of paths that had Utah going up against either UCLA or USC, both number 1 seeds as well. Not that those wouldn't be easy, but at least, you know, you're closer. You can maybe get some fans here, that kind of stuff. But either way, you know, drawing that 8 seed was tough. Kind of shows how their early exit in the Big 12 tournament really impacted their game, or at least their seeding. You know, they were looking at maybe a 7-6 seed. You know, getting that 6 seed would have been a much better draw for them. But this is the nature of the game, right? Like, you've got to be able to hit out all the times, and you got to be consistent. So we'll see what happens there. And then also the men's basketball team. You know, a lot of people, including myself, had, you know, kind of cast them aside to be dead in terms of playing in the postseason. and they keep coming. So you've got the college basketball crown. I mentioned this last week in my last podcast, talking about this being an avenue for them. They did accept an invite to the college basketball crown. As I mentioned last time, this is an opportunity for these teams to get some money that's allocated towards NIL. So there's some advantage to playing here. You know, a lot of people are going to call this the third tier basketball tournament, and they're not entirely wrong. But it's an opportunity for Fox and its member schools, so to speak, to kind of participate in another tournament. But the reality is some of these teams just didn't have great seasons, and Utah's right along with it. So it's interesting to see kind of where this is going to be, kind of what's going to happen. This all takes place in Las Vegas, and it doesn't happen for another 2 weeks. And so you're going to get a majority of the NCAA tournament, teams that are out of competition by then, and Utah will barely begin their competition on March 31st at 1 p.m. in Las Vegas playing Butler. So interesting, curious to see how this goes. By all accounts, it sounds like the team is embracing this. They're ready to go. You do have Jake Walling and now today Hunter Erickson put his name in the transfer portal. Jake Walling specifically had mentioned that he was going to, still participate in this tournament, but wanted to give himself options, as been mentioned. But this is kind of the nature of this right now, where this becomes a difficult time to have this tournament because the NCAA transfer portal opens up next week. Utah's has already been opened. With the second Craig Smith got fired, that opens up a 30-day window. And so theirs has been open for this entire time. But it's a situation where you've got guys that are going to potentially trying to be looking for new teams, guys that are going to see if, Alex Jensen wants to keep them on the roster. And so there's just a lot of guys that are going to put their names in the portal to be able to at least give themselves some flexibility, allow themselves to kind of see their value in the market. Some of these guys don't have as much value as the others, obviously. A guy like Ezra Asar is probably going to get a significant amount of attention, going to have a lot of people, especially on the East Coast, he's going to be attracted there. He's got family out there. He's got kids out there. This is probably a tough situation for Utah to keep him, but that's not to say that he doesn't want to be in Utah. So really fascinated to see what happens there. But all this is going to happen in the middle of Utah still essentially keeping with its season. And, it's a team that wants to continue to play for each other. So we'll see how it goes. If something can change in the next 2 weeks that allow this team to go on a run, maybe that's important and they can get to the semifinals or finals similar to what they did in the NIT last year. But, really interested to see how this goes in the first iteration of this college basketball crown. There are 5 teams from the Big 12 that were selected there. So, a majority of those teams were selected in the NCAA tournament, and the rest essentially were in this. But, you're getting a team like Arizona State, who only won 4 conference games, not a lot going for it. Bobby Hurley was on the hot seat, but it sounds like he's going to be saved for another year. So, the variability with these teams are going to be really interesting. Even Utah's opponent in Butler, they've only won 14 games this season, lost 19. But that's not to say that Utah can't lose this game. So we'll see. As we get closer, maybe we'll do a quote-unquote deep dive onto this. I'm not going to go too deep because let's be real. But at the same time, that's kind of the nature of where things are at right now. So you've got the 2 basketball teams that are still competing and moving forward in postseason play. So let's move on to Alex Jensen, because I know that's what most people are paying attention to. And we've talked a lot about Alex for the last few weeks. I feel like even before he was hired, we were talking about Alex because he was their prime candidate. So, this is kind of the finality of that in the sense that we finally got him introduced. It's kind of a weird setting, especially for who Alex is. He's much more of an introverted guy. He's not over the top. He's not going to be the one that comes in there and gives the rah-rah, pep talk and you feel fired up listening to him. He's very much so more of a introverted guy that, he clearly knows what's going on, is a brilliant mind, but he's not about the showiness. And so the fact that the University of Utah did a press conference where you could have fans attend was just kind of contrary to who he is. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. Obviously, you want to be able to drum up support, and you want to get people excited to be able to see the legend that is Alex Jensen. But it is something to keep in mind, right? Like, this isn't him. He's not going to come in there and quote unquote win the press conference by, like I said, saying these rah-rah things and, we're going to the NCAA tournament, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's much more methodical, much more careful, I'd say. He's very intelligent in kind of how he processes this information. And so just a different vibe, right? Either way, there was a good showing, maybe 500-600 people that showed up to support, and you don't need a ton more, honestly. I mean, that shows the support. It shows that, there's interest here. You get people out, especially top donors, and you get them excited for it. It matters that way. And so I think Utah accomplished its goal that way. They did what they needed to be able to welcome him into the era, into his era at Utah. The crazy thing is it's there seems to be this heavy emphasis on trying to rekindle kind of that late 90s magic with Rick Majerus, right? And I get the sense that as, you're going into this, they're paying heavy amounts of attention on trying to make Alex that next iteration of Rick Majerus. Now, obviously, nobody's trying to say that he's Rick Majerus, right? Like, that's not what I'm trying to say here. But I think to an extent, the university tried, well, it's not even to an extent, it was pretty overtly trying to drum up the old feelings of the Runnin Utes, right? And trying to be able to get the interest there where now you're bringing in one of your own who lived through those glory days and see if you can kind of bring it back, right? Mark Harlan said, as part of his introduction, he says, what we've done here, it's rather simple. We have reached into our past to develop our future, and it's time for a new day. And none of that is wrong, and I don't think anything there is inaccurate or problematic. Clearly they did reach back to their past to be able to develop their future. And I think there's a lot of optimism around that. And I think one of the other comments that Harlan gave kind of leans into where they were at, right? He said, if we could reach into the past, as long as that person was the best, as long as that person was the best for this team going forward, then that would be great. And boy, did we get that in Alex Jensen. There was a clear emphasis that Utah wanted somebody that was part of that system, right? They'd gone through these different guys that had had success at various levels, up-and-coming coaches or guys that have been, these proven guys at the NBA level or something like that. And it's not that there wasn't success, right? Obviously, Larry Kostoviak, he had success. He got his teams to the NCAA tournament. He recruited mostly well and was able to build rosters together. It just kind of fell apart at the end. And then you have Craig Smith, an up-and-coming coach who'd won everywhere he was before that. It was going to be able to get Utah back to the NCAA tournament. But the reality was Craig had no natural ties to Utah other than coaching up at Utah State, right? And so there wasn't anything there. Now there was a lot of interest to be able to bring somebody from that Rick Majerus age, right? And being able to get them who had the coaching acumen to be able to do that kind of stuff. And obviously a guy like Andre Miller, a guy like Alex Jensen, there's other guys that have been talked about that could be in there. But Alex was always that guy. He was the one that they circled from the very beginning. They obviously talked to their trustees. They talked to their donors. They talked to all the people that they needed to be able to make sure that this was going to be a thing. And, you do this knowing that, okay, obviously he's well respected in the coaching community. The Dallas Mavericks wanted him, right? Like, this isn't one of those things where it was just like Utah came along and it was just like, hey, Alex, do you want this job? And he's like, well, I got nothing else going on for me right now. I'm going to take it. No, this is one of those things where Dallas was fighting for him, right? Like, they were pushing and trying to make sure that they could keep him because they wanted him. They see his value. So I think that says a lot of kind of the character and who Alex is in terms of them wanting to keep it. The Dallas Mavericks are going through quite the trial right now of their own doing, by my dad. They lose Luka Doncic to their own stupidity and trade. And then they get Anthony Davis in return, and we still don't know the full ramifications of that, but it automatically seemed like a loss. And so you've got this sudden franchise-altering move that changes it, and now you've got a coach that Alex talked about being really conflicted with. He had a good thing there in the NBA. He liked what he was doing, and he was, in the middle of coaching. This is not one of those things where he was trying to look for a job in the middle of his coaching, but the right opportunity came about, and there was parts of himself that he felt guilty, right? Like he felt guilty for even looking for another job because he was committed to the Dallas Mavericks. And I think that shows his character, right? Like he's committed to the people that he's invested with. That's why he's still going to continue to coach with the Dallas Mavericks to the end of this season. He wants to be able to be a part of them. He talked about, Dallas probably would be okay with him being able to move on and just say, look, go focus. But that's the type of guy he is, where he's committed and he wants to be able to see it through. So, this is a good thing for Utah that they were able to get a guy that they wanted, right? So you're checking all the boxes immediately from the very beginning. You've got a guy from the Rick Majerus era who just so happens to be very intelligent, who understands the X's and O's, who understands, how to be a genuine guy. And that was kind of the theme that Alex pointed, is he wants to be genuine, but how to be a genuine guy who understands the Utah market because he grew up here, he's coached here in the NBA, he understands it at a high level. And then you get a guy that gets people excited. And so I think all of those things from the very beginning, you checked all the boxes, right? And so from the very beginning, everybody feels like this is a home run hire. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I think there's still a lot of things that have to happen. And Alex is one of the first to admit that, like, he doesn't know, right? He doesn't know what's going to be successful. He understands the NBA at a very high level. The last 13 years he's been at the NBA. And so he understands that game at a very high level and understands what it takes to be able to be there. Now, obviously, the collegiate game has changed more to closer, resemble an NBA model, whether that be through GMs, working with agents, trying to get guys into a team that have to deal with roster management in terms of money or other things like that. There's a lot of that kind of aspects of it. But at the end of the day, it's still college. And so there's going to be some different nuances that are going to change that. I mean, he talked about when he last was coaching in the college ranks, text messaging was just barely okayed, right? Now that seems like so long ago. 2011, he was allowed to start, texting people, and how he thought, oh man, this is going to be crazy. Now you've got it where, you've got NIL involved. You've got to go with different things that way, and it's going to cause a lot more problems. And so there's things that he's going to have to learn. And he's not oblivious to that, right? He says everything is going to be evolving, and he's going to try to move towards that. But as part of that, there's no delusion here that he's trying to recreate what Majerus did. Obviously, you're trying to recreate what the winning was, but you're not trying to make Alex Jensen Rick Majerus 2.0, right? And anybody that is doing that is putting him up for failure, quite honestly. I think if you're going into this, whether that be from the athletic department, whether that be from the university as a whole, or donors or trustees or whatever it may be, if they are going into this believing that he's going to be Rick Majerus 2.0, they're going to be sorely disappointed. And it's unfair to Alex Jensen to be able to do that, right? And so I think there's a situation here where he has to acknowledge the past and kind of own up to that, but also realize that he has to chart his own path. And I didn't get anything from his press conference conversations where he doesn't believe that, right? This is all his show, and he understands it. Now, I say that, like, that makes it sound like he's very condescending in that. That's not who he is. But this is his show, and he understands that, you've got to pay, respect and everything to that era, respect to kind of why you've been hired on at Utah. But at the same time, he's been hired on to do a job in the present. And so I'm really fascinated to kind of see how this goes, what kind of influence people are going to have. I hope for his sake that, he doesn't always have to rely on, oh, well, Rick Majerus said this, Rick Majerus said that. Like, quite honestly, I don't think he's thought about Rick Majerus, at least at a high level or on a day-to-day basis, just in a long time, because that's not his world. He's lived in the NBA. Nobody gives a dang about, like, what Rick Majerus did at the college level, at the NBA level, right? He worked with Quinn Snyder. He's worked with Jason Kidd. He's worked with guys that have been instrumental in the shape of the NBA. Rick Majerus is another, a distant memory. However, as I was standing around, as I was listening to the conversations that he was having with different people, it almost felt like he had to kind of tie everything back to how Rick Majerus did things. And so I hope for his sake that kind of dies a little bit, that he doesn't feel the need to always tie things back to, this is how he did it, or this is how I learned to do it. And I hope that, he's not pigeonholed into a situation where he has to do that. Because at the end of the day, you're setting him up for failure. And in various ways, a coach like Craig Smith was kind of set up for failure. Yeah, he did some of the things on his own, right? Like, I get that. We've talked about that. But, like, if you're going to hire this legendary, player from back in the day and you're setting him up for failure from the very beginning, it's not going to be great. I don't think Utah's doing that yet, right? Like, I don't think that that's the case. Obviously, they wanted to pay tribute to that. They brought his jersey. That they did different things that way. So, there are some of that to be able to pay respect to that, and you're going to do that in these introductory press conferences. This is who you are, right? You're coming home, and they leaned into that pretty heavily. But now that he's home, you have to hit the ground running and do it differently. And so we'll see how that goes. I'm like I said, I'm fascinated to kind of see how it works. But at the end of the day, Jensen said that he felt like the timing was right. He felt like everything kind of worked its way where coming back home to Utah, just everything felt right. Obviously, the decisions around the Dallas Mavericks and kind of what they did in that trade, that played a part in that. And he, to some extent, he even felt guilty for leaving that situation because he wants to be able to kind of keep things stable for the Mavericks. Obviously, things aren't stable for the Mavericks right now. And that's their GM's own fault and the front office's fault and, the rest of the coaching staff and all the players, they have to manage that. But you've got a guy that felt the timing was right to come to Utah, but still somewhat felt guilty about it because he wanted to make sure that everything was right there. So really, really loyal guy, really interested in trying to do what's right for the organization. And I think you're going to see a lot of that at Utah. Now, there comes a point where that can be a little too much, right? Where you listen too much to people or you listen to things that, are not necessarily in his own best interest. But he's a smart man. He's going to understand how to pay respect to some of that stuff while still kind of charting his own path. So looking at that, the first things that have to happen, obviously, is putting a staff together. He's got to be able to get that. Everybody wants to know, is it going to be Andre Miller, right? And obviously there's been conversations about him accepting the job. My understanding is that it's pretty close, right? Like that he's right there, that he will be a part of the staff. Things could change, but it sounds like there's enough interest on both sides that, there's more smoke than not, right? Like, so it leads you to believe that Andre Miller will be on the coaching staff. Now, as the rest of his staffing goes, that's to be determined. But as I mentioned last time before we had the press conference, there's going to be an emphasis in kind of the NBA model, right? You're going to have to try to find a GM. You're going to have to find guys and how they evaluate talent at the NBA level and kind of what's going on there. He sees the NBA, as rightfully so, as a place where you're not developing talent. Like you are, but it's like fine-tuning it, right? It's not a place where you're trying to craft it and trying to get it. He feels like this era, in terms of college basketball, is where he can kind of develop that talent. And he can develop it in a way that will gear them towards an NBA model. And if it works, now you've got guys that are going to be able to be successfully moving towards the next level. Now, obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into a guy getting to the NBA, right? And there's been many coaches out there who have NBA experience, have been in the NBA, it doesn't always translate naturally just to the NBA, right? So, like, it's not like, oh, well, he's an NBA coach, and so that means now all the guys that are going to come to Utah are going to be these NBA stars or guys that want to do it, and then they're suddenly going to go be these first-round lottery pick type players. No, that's not a guarantee. But at the same time, the foundation, we'll say, is going to be very NBA heavy, especially early on. But at the same time, as he's still working with the Mavericks, he recognizes that causes quite a problem in trying to create a staff. He understands that he's splitting his time, and if anything, he's giving more to the Mavericks right now. And so he wants to be able to get guys that can kind of help fill things out for him. But at the end of the day, he's got to be the one that kind of signs off on everything, right? And so he's got to put together a staff that he trusts and that he's ready for. And as part of that, he says, I want to take my time and do it right instead of rushing. In fact, I've talked to a lot of former college coaches that said that. Take time with your staff and do it and get it right. So I don't think you're going to see him necessarily rushing. That's not to say that you can't have, guys announce this week that they're being hired. but I don't think it's going to be this mad rush to all of a sudden have a staff by the end of the week and suddenly, they're hitting the ground running. No, there's going to be a lot of slow movement in terms of that. He's going to try to do what he can to be able to get a staff together. And as part of that, it's got to be focused on obviously developing talent. It's got to be focused on recruiting, and you've got to hit the recruiting one first, essentially, right? Like, you've got to be able to get guys in. You've either got to figure out your roster. Who are the guys that are going to come back? Who do you need to fight for to keep coming back? Who are you going to let walk? You've got to start evaluating all that talent. And, he's had conversations, obviously, with the team. The team was all there to support him. Even, guys that are in the transfer portal or rumored to be in the transfer portal, everybody was there, including the old staff. And some of that staff is also looking to see if they can get a job on his current staff, right? And so it's this kind of weird situation where, especially with them being in the college basketball crown, they're still involved in the thick of it, right? They haven't moved on from their season yet. But at the same time, Utah is already making all indications to move on to that next era. And so it's this just kind of weird blending of time. But it gives Jensen a little bit more time to kind of figure out what guys he wants, how he wants to shape that roster and do everything that way. So we'll see how that goes. Similarly to recruiting, he understands that he needs to hit the ground running, right? He understands that he has to be there and do all that stuff. But being with the Mavericks changes that as well. But really curious to see kind of how he attacks that. As I mentioned earlier, he's not a guy that's going to just come into your home, and he's not going to be the Sharif Shah, right? Like, he's not going to come in there and blow down your door and win you over with this eloquent speech and just kind of really make you feel committed to the program. He's going to come in there with a much more down-to-earth approach. He calls it he wants to be genuine with everybody, right? He wants them to be able to see who he is and be able to commit to Utah because he's going to be genuine in how he does things. He says it's a relationship-based model, which it is. And some of that he's going to have to learn, how does the NIL factor into that, right? Because as much as it is a relationship-based model, like it always has been, there's a lot more that goes into it than just that, right? And he says that. He says there's a lot of work that needs to be done and it never stops, and that's where a lot of the wars are won, is in the recruiting. And so he understands this, right? Like, we're not saying anything that he doesn't understand. But at the same time, it's trying to navigate all of that kind of stuff. He joked about, maybe he'll have to get a Twitter account now so that he can do stuff on the recruiting front. There's going to be a lot of those things where he's going to, have to find all that stuff. So I expect him to surround himself with guys that are very familiar with recruiting, especially at Utah. Maybe that's a guy like Lo Leith, who was in the AAU circuit. David Evans, who obviously coached here in Utah and understands a lot of the recruiting, whether it be here locally or internationally, there's going to be some emphasis there. And so do you kind of keep that roster together this year in terms of those guys? Do you move some of them to a GM role? You could move a guy like a David Evans to a GM role potentially. And what does that do? Or do you keep him on the staff? There's a lot of these things that he's going to have to figure out, and a lot of that has to be based in recruiting. So we'll see what happens. Obviously the coaching staff that's currently there has already put out offers for kids. I would have to imagine that Alex Jensen is okay with that, for them to do it. You generally don't offer kids if you've got 1 foot out the door. I think all of these coaches on the staff right there, they do want to return. I haven't gotten any indications that any of them don't want to be there. So, really fascinated by that. Now, as part of that, what's his play style going to be? A lot of people look at the Big 12 and it's very physical. Are you going to play that, a physical type of game? Are you going to play very guard heavy? He said his style is going to be very NBA focused. It's going to be hard nosed, playing fast and free, while also not being afraid to make mistakes. And he's going to want teams to hate playing against us. That's how he said it. But he said he'll tailor that to his personnel, right? It's easy to sit here and say, I want this, 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 and this. But if you can't get the players to come and be able to do that, that's a challenge, right? There's a lot of things that Craig Smith wanted to do, and forever he wanted to play with two bigs, and he wanted to be able to do different things where he worked more of a traditional inside-out type game, and it didn't always work that way with the personnel that he had. As the latter parts of his career, he got more similar to what he wanted. But even then, he looked at this team and he understood, there's not a lot of guys that are just like your spot-up shooters, right? The guys that are just going to take over a game, be your star. He recognized that he needed more talent there. And so as much as that's the style that Alex Jensen wants to run, it's going to be very different based on the personnel that he gets. And if he can get the right guys, sure, maybe that works, right? But that's what everybody's trying to do, right? Like that's why, this roster management is important. You're trying to be able to find a model that is current. You're trying to find a model that's going to take advantage of opposing teams, and you want guys that are going to be committed. He talked very specifically of not he wanted guys that were going to be committed to the program, not just because they could make a bunch of bucks. Obviously, that's going to be a factor. But it's similar to kind of how he approaches the NBA. He wants guys committed to a team because they want to be a part of that organization, that franchise in the NBA. And obviously, the money takes care of itself, right? Like, that's a different part of that role. And so if he can get all of those pieces to hit, then he feels like he's got what he needs. But I wouldn't be surprised at all to have a lot more spacing. He wants to be able to be physical. He wants to be hard-nosed. He wants to get that defense, that defensive mentality where he's just challenging everybody, and if he can do that, that's going to bode well in the Big 12. That's the style of the Big 12. He's got to be able to find different wrinkles that allow himself to be successful there. There's teams that don't run it that way, right? For example, Kansas is very contrary to what a lot of the Big 12 teams do. They find success that way. Whatever he wants to do and whatever style he wants to work with, it can have its advantages if you own it, right? It doesn't matter. He doesn't have to follow the Houston plan. He doesn't have to follow the Iowa State plan or the BYU plan or whatever that plan is. He's got to follow whatever plan he wants to do, and they need to execute it at a high level. And he expects his team to be able to execute certain things at a high level on a day-to-day basis. He wants that consistency. He wants to be able to maintain that. Look, this isn't anything earth-shattering, right? Like, it's not like, oh, Alex Jensen, he's so smart. He wants to do, like, this is the things that most coaches want. But I think you're going to see a lot of that in the coming months, especially as they get into summer workouts, kind of what's going to happen there, the types of guys that he's going to recruit. You'll kind of paint the picture a little bit of what's going on there. So, don't want to beat a dead horse right here. We've talked a lot about Alex Jensen, but at the same time, to me, I've had a lot of, I was asked this on the radio yesterday, and I've thought about it as well. What does success mean in year one for Jensen? Everybody's going to want him to be in the NCAA tournament. And is that the true success for him? Maybe. Like, as you saw, look, just a few miles down the road, Kevin Young was able to get his team to the NCAA tournament with BYU. I would argue that they were already kind of an NCAA tournament style team before he got there, and so it was easier to kind of make that jump, right? That's not to say that he hasn't been a good coach and he hasn't learned along the way and adjusted to kind of where they needed to be, but he had a team that was essentially already there. Utah, they haven't been there for a long time. They've been a perennial NIT type level team for the last few years. And so getting a team to that level is going to be a much harder climb. And so, I don't want to sit here and put false expectations on what Alex Jensen can be, knowing what he's got. And especially if he has to re-recruit an entire roster, that becomes a challenge, especially the deeper you have to go. If you have to find 15 guys, that becomes a real tall task in that first season. But if you can find, 6-7 guys and you're bringing in depth pieces that way, and those 6-7 guys are phenomenal pieces, maybe you have that opportunity. And so I don't know that we can fully understand what a successful year one can be for him. But to me, the best way that I can say it is, one, you have to see if they're making progress towards the end of the season, right? Are they falling off like Utah has done the last few years, or are they still trending in the right way? That doesn't mean they have to be winning all their games. That doesn't mean they have to be, in the NCAA conversation. But at the same time, like, you've got to kind of be close to that, right? Like, you've got to be maybe not necessarily in the bubble, but you've got to be able to be somewhat in that conversation. To me, it's more viewing it from the standpoint of where Utah in the last 2 years, whether it was with Larry or with Craig, they had these games where they could compete, right? Like, they could go out there and they could go beat the Kansas, right? You can go beat BYU this year. And then after that, there was this huge letdown where you go lose to UCF. If you're getting a lot of that continuing with Alex Jensen, I don't know how you manage that, right? Like, obviously, year one, you're going to give him a pass. But, like, you've got to be able to find ways to be able to move past that. You've got to show an upward trajectory. and being able to say, look, they don't have all the pieces there yet, but we can see that they're clearly making those steps, right? And I feel like you can, it's hard to kind of articulate what that is, but I think you can just see it watching a team. You can kind of get the general vibe of it, the momentum of it. These are things that you can't necessarily place, but you can kind of get that feel. Whereas with some of these teams that Utah's had the last few years, you can see that they fizzle out, especially around January, February, and by March, it's crashing into the tournament, right? And so if you can get something where you can challenge, you could argue Craig Smith's third year outside of getting injuries to Raleigh Wooster and Gabe Madsen, they were heading towards the NCAA tournament, right? And I'd be fascinated to know how that would have changed everything if they got there. But at the same time, you could see that they were making progress, right? There was conversations about, hey, could this be an NCAA tournament team? I think that's kind of where you want this team. If you can be in those conversations and be like, can they be there? Can they be in the mix of that? That they're not just going out there and they're putting out a losing effort every single day. And there's not to say that can't happen. It's not easy in your very first year, especially as a new coach in the collegiate level, to come out there and just hit the ground running. Obviously, you have the non-conference play, and that can help you, but you're going to get smacked in the face in the Big 12, right? Like, you're going to have a very challenging task. But I think if he can get his guys bought in, there's a real possibility that they can continue to improve. He's been with losing teams, right? Like with the Jazz, he's been with losing teams. He's currently with a team with the Mavericks that they've got their whole situation flipped around. It's learning how to work through that adversity and still getting the most out of your team. And I think he's the guy that can do that. So in my view, obviously, in the Big 12, you want to be a top 8 seed, right? And I think if you're a top 8 seed, that's a good conversation point to be able to say you're close to the NCAA tournament. It's not a guarantee, and obviously that varies based on other conferences and everything. You look at the SEC, and they had like 900 teams that were invited to the NCAA tournament. Obviously, you have to see what the level of competition is around you. But I think if you can look at it and you can get within the top 8 of the league by the end of the season, I have to imagine that's progress. And obviously that would be progress from what this last year was. But I think that would show like a good benchmark, right? Like if you can finish middle of the league and you're challenging potentially to be a bubble team or the NCAA tournament, maybe you still make the NIT, that's fine. I think that's okay. Obviously fans are going to want the NCAA tournament, and that's just the unfortunate thing in basketball world, where if you don't make that, it becomes a challenge, and instantly, everything's terrible and everything's over, right? Obviously, they want to make the tournament. That's where they're going to try to go. But I think a realistic expectation is kind of around there. If you can get more of that, if you're challenging for a top 4 seed, you're probably in the NCAA tournament. You're most likely in the NCAA tournament, especially in the Big 12. And so I think, being in the middle of that, you're still in the mix, right? And you can challenge it. I think that's a good spot for Utah. They showed that, if you win a couple of the other games, you can be right there. Look, you go beat UCF, or you go beat Oklahoma State, or you go beat like some of these other teams that Utah lost to, you're right there in the mix. And suddenly you're a top 8 seeded team going into this with a little bit different momentum. And so I think if Alex can kind of take what Utah's done this year and improve it just marginally, I think that's a good success for the next year. So I'd be fascinated to hear what you guys think. What do you think is success in the first year? Hit me up on Twitter if you want to weigh in on that. But for the most part, I think this is still something that we'll have to kind of weigh based on, who comes back to Utah, what his roster looks like, what the rest of the Big 12 looks like. I don't want to fully judge who this person could be as a coach until we understand all the factors, right? It's why, like, especially nowadays in college football, let's say, where all of a sudden you're putting out the way too early top 25, we haven't even gone through the full transfer portal yet. And guys are suddenly like talking about, oh, this team's going to do it. Now, let's be real. A lot of the blue-blooded teams and teams that are already at the top are going to be there, right? Like, so we get that. But I think that's the same kind of situation here. Is we can't judge who Alex Jensen is going to be. This is going to be hard. I keep trying to say Alex Smith, and obviously both former Utes. And so if I ever say that, I apologize. It is Alex Jensen. But for these last few weeks, I've had to work really hard to not say Alex Smith. So with Alex Jensen, I don't want to judge, too unfairly of what is going to happen, and kind of see what's going on there. I want to be able to kind of see how he puts things together before we kind of start, pigeonholing him into certain spots in the conference. I don't think they will be picked 16th this year. I think they'll be an improvement from that. But I'm really fascinated to see kind of how they build a roster comparative to the rest of the league, what other teams do, and see what they can work with. So we'll go from there. Obviously, still a lot to talk about, and as we start getting coaches and we start getting players committed, then we'll have more conversations. But for the most part, it's still kind of status quo until these things start changing. At the end of the day, though, you have hired Alex Jensen. He's here on campus partially, and he's working towards getting Utah back into those glory days. So we'll see what happens. We'll continue to talk about it, and we'll continue to see what's going on. But let's talk football. This podcast primarily surrounds football, and I'd be honest to say that I love talking football the most. Basketball was always my first love. I've loved basketball forever, but I've really grown to love football, especially over the last few years. It speaks to me more. And so, we'll jump into that. Spring football does start on Thursday. You will get your first practice there. They do get 15 practices throughout, 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it is. I can't remember how many weeks. I think it's whatever it is. They get that spread up. Essentially, you get about 2 practices a week, and we'll get opportunities to be able to see them. This week, unfortunately, I will not be up at the University of Utah for spring camp. My son has a baseball tournament in St. George, and so that's where I'm going to be. I'll still be writing about it, still paying attention to what's going on, but I will unfortunately not be there for the first little bit to be able to see. And it's not the end of the world. The first day of practice is always the funniest of it, because there's nothing you can talk about really, right? Like, you're obviously getting guys talking about their excitement being back and different things that way, but nothing's happened yet, right? You can talk about some of the stuff that's happened in the off season, or maybe ask some questions about some other things. But for the most part, the first week-ish, there's not going to be a ton of value or a lot of information coming out. It's more as we get closer to the end of spring camp, we're going to start seeing, what's happening. At the same time, though, we do get an opportunity to talk to the coaches this week, all of the position coaches, and they can give us kind of their mindset of what they're going to be approaching this year. And as part of that, obviously, there's a lot of conversations about different aspects of this team, right? And that's the same every single year. But the biggest questions for me is, how is this offense going to come together? How is the offense going to gel? They've obviously done a really good job of resetting the offense, bringing pieces in that are going to be high level, whether that be Devin Dampier or Wayshawn Parker at running back, who's going to step up at wide receiver, those kinds of things. Those are those questions that I have going into this. And I think that's going to be the most fascinating and telling part of this team. We know the defense always finds ways to move forward, right? That's not to say that there aren't questions there, and I think on the defensive line especially, there's going to be questions there. Who's going to step up? Who are the guys leading the pack? What does Utah want to look for going into spring camp, and how are they going to feel settled? Those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the defense has been such a well-oiled machine for so long that it almost becomes a guarantee. And there's going to come a time when it isn't. There's varying degrees of success for this defense. But at the same time, it's still by and large a successful unit. And so there's going to be talks about the defensive line. There's going to be talks about who steps up at corner, who's going to be those guys that are there, who's going to be your safeties, those kinds of things, all important questions. And we'll try to hit on all of those. But the story of spring camp especially is the offense. And I think, with how much Utah reset in the offseason, this becomes where this Utah team can go moving forward, right? Obviously, fans of Utah expect the team to be able to be competitive in the Big 12. They expect them to be in the Big 12 championship and really show this next year what they believe Utah can be, right? Last year was an anomaly. You could even argue 2 years ago was an anomaly, at least in Utah fans' minds. But if it becomes a trend and suddenly that offense isn't as good anymore, is it an anomaly, or is it a situation where this is Utah trending in the opposite direction? And this becomes kind of the test to that, I would say. There's reasons to explain the last 2 years, and we've documented those in so many different stories and podcasts that we're not going to go into that. But I think there's reasons for optimism to be able to go into this spring camp knowing that you have talent, that you have the right pieces in the room to be able to get back to those winning days, right? Where you can challenge in the Big 12. Even with as bad as the offense was last year specifically, Utah still challenged and were losing by, one-score games. There was, a couple of games, the Colorado game specifically, where you got blown out, but for the most part, you were challenging in that game, and then just, the wheels continued to fall off at the very end, and it just compounded on each other, and Colorado capitalized, right? These are one of those things where these games were close. And so Utah believes that they're right there. I don't think anybody in that offensive staff, defensive staff, special team staff, whatever it may be, they don't believe that they can't challenge for a Big 12 championship. Now, they're not going to be picked to win the conference. There's going to be other teams, whether that be Iowa State, Kansas State, BYU, you could argue Baylor, Texas Tech. There's a lot of teams that are going to be looked at as potential options to win the conference. Like, I didn't even mention Kansas. But you've got other teams that are going to be in there where Utah absolutely could come into this conference for the next year and be picked to finish 6th or 7th. And Utah fans will mock that and say, are you kidding me? Like, you don't know what you have. But the reality is they saw that last year, right? They saw a Utah team that really floundered, didn't have an offense, couldn't compete in the Big 12. And so what else are you going to go off of? And until you see the talent on the field, it's tough to understand what Utah truly has. Now, they've put these pieces together in a way that on paper, once again, this Utah team looks stacked. Does it have maybe all of the full, complete answers that we thought they were going to have last year? No. But by and large, that didn't work out. And as I've mentioned before, Utah, worked really hard to be able to build around Cam Rising. And then when he went out, that really tanked their team's chances because it was all based on Cam Rising. This year, there's been a much more concerted effort to be able to build a full complement of players that can kind of work with each other, right? Obviously, Devin Dampier is going to highlight that offense. And based on what he did at New Mexico and kind of the different flashes that he had, obviously there could be potential Heisman talk. Now, look, if you want to go back and listen to my Heisman talk episode, you can. I don't think he's going to be in the Heisman conversation, right? So don't get it twisted. But at the same time, he shows the type of skill set that if everything goes the right way, he's absolutely in that conversation. And if he's in that conversation, that obviously shows that other players on the team are doing well, the Utah offense is churning, everything is doing well. But I don't think you can rely on that, right? Like, I don't think you can sit here and be like, well, Devin Dampier had such a great year last year that, we can just walk in here and everything's going to be great. Injuries happen. There's, pieces don't fit together where they just don't jive. Different things don't work. But with that said, I think Utah has a big advantage in the sense that their offensive line returns. They've got two guys especially anchoring that, with Spencer Fano leading the charge, Caleb Lomu on the other side. But Spencer Fano specifically, he's being talked about as one of the best in the league. And he's backed it up, right? Like he's clearly showing in his advanced metrics and just standard metrics, what type of player he can be. So if there is to be success, that offensive line has to be successful, right? And they've got to gel and they've got to do whatever to be able to be successful. But beyond that, it's how does the rest of the team work together? Utah's going to be, most likely run heavy, but I'm curious to see kind of the balance that Kyle Whittingham wants to run. If you talk to him, he thinks that they still run it kind of a more 50-50, and at times they do. But for the most part, last year they put a huge emphasis on trying to pass the ball a lot. In years past, it's obviously been his standard MO to run the ball more. That's the primary thing. But I think you're going to see more of that. But does Jason Beck come in here and he kind of mix it up a little bit? We've talked about kind of what he does and kind of the different things there that kind of gets guys open, gets free, frees up space, does different things to be able to help that offense churn. That's a little bit more modern. It is a lot more modern. It's a lot more based on the personnel and what they have. And so who are those guys that are going to stand up in spring? This is where you kind of see some of those guys that you can kind of see their hunger. Last year, there was guys that stepped up, and then they get to fall, and it didn't necessarily follow. And so you've got to kind of build on that, right? Like you got to stack days, so to speak, is what they say. And so I think it starts here in spring. Who are some of these guys that maybe aren't being talked about right now? Obviously, Devin Dampier and Wayshawn Parker are going to be two guys that people are fascinated by. But who are the guys behind them or complementary to them on other positions, whether that be in the wide receiver positions, tight end positions, different position groups, who are going to be those guys that step up? And I think that to me has me the most fascinated because I want to see how this team is going to come together. Are there going to be a lot of individualized performances, or is there going to be a team that complements each other? Do they have a good vibe coming out of spring? Those are kind of things that I'm looking at. And so really fascinated again, with what Kyle Whittingham and the coaches are going to be focused on this spring. You can probably pencil in a few of these things, but I think by and large, there's going to be a huge emphasis in talking about the offense and kind of what they're going to do. It's the sexy position groups to talk about, right? Like I'll go write about the defense and I get very few people that want to read about it. Not always. But then you write about the offense and everybody's excited about it. I think this one lends itself to that a ton just because there's going to be a lot of interest in that. So I'm curious to see what happens there. Really interested in how that offense is going to come together. But we get that. We get 20 minutes of viewing, so we'll get a little bit more insight than what you're used to getting. But at the same time, it's watered down. They're not going to be running full sets of what they're planning in fall. But at least we get an idea of kind of who are kind of breaking away and what's going to happen there. So as part of that, this week starts the Big 12 Pro Days down in Texas. All of the teams, they have participants that come down to Texas, Frisco, Texas, to be able to compete in Big 12 Pro Day. And so the Big 12 operates this very similar to the NFL Combine, where you have certain position groups go on different days, different times, and all these players will work together. Utah has a large group coming. Not all of these guys are NFL caliber players, at least, for draftable caliber. But you've got some really interesting prospects there, and who's going to go. So the list is Van Fillinger, Tavita Fotu, Connor O'Toole, Karene Reed, Miki Sugarataga, Junior Tafuna, who obviously competed in the NFL Combine. Karene Reed did too, mostly through the interviews, but he got injured in the Senior Bowl and wasn't able to participate. Damian Alford, this is a guy that put his name in the transfer portal, committed to FIU, and then withdrew and is now going to go for the NFL. So curious to see what happens there. Doesn't have a ton of body of work at Utah, but did at Syracuse. So we'll see there. Mekhi Bernard, obviously a lot of people were really disappointed that he didn't get a lot more love from these like Senior Bowl games or the NFL Combine, stuff like that. So really curious to see if he can show out and be effective. Alakai Gilman, Brant Keithy, Caleb Lohner, you may have seen his tweet yesterday talking about how despite all of his kind of twists and turns of his career, he's going to put forth an effort to make it in the NFL. Really fascinated to kind of see what his status will be. I think if he can continue to make progress that he did with Utah this year and kind of shows out that way, can really get down his blocking and can use his hands well. I think this could be a home run for an NFL team. Probably won't get drafted. I'd be very surprised if he did. But he's got the body type. He's got the ability, as we saw. I wish there would have been more production from him this year, but that was the whole Utah offense as a whole. But I really think he could be an offensive weapon that would work well. So really curious to see how that goes. Then you've got Money Parks, Dorian Singer. That's the big disappointment for Utah fans. He obviously put in a waiver to be able to get a fifth year of eligibility. And by all accounts, it sounds like that has been denied. And so he's pursuing the NFL. Tough situation for Utah to not have him, but he has to move on with his life and do what he needs to do the best for him. So you got that, and then you got Zamayavon, and then JT Greep, a special teamer. So a lot of players, a lot of big names from Utah's days in there. Curious to see kind of what goes on, but I have to imagine that this year's NFL draft doesn't necessarily have that many players from Utah that go. There's a lot of guys kind of on the fringe. But that's the hard part. Some of them are kind of tweeners in the position, like a Karene Reed. He's kind of a bit smaller for that position group, but obviously shows a ton of tremendous upside. Very intelligent player that maybe that gives him a nod in some situations. So Curious to see what happens if some teams take a flyer on any of these players and kind of what happens there. So that'll be going on all this week. I'll do my best to kind of see how things are going, what kind of stuff comes out of Texas and the reporting and what's going on. Clearly, I'm not going down there, but we'll see what happens there. So you do have all of that happening this week, so football becomes kind of top of mind, and we'll get into that. But then lastly, just real quick, just talking about the Red Rocks. They're now entering the postseason as well. And if you were at the Huntsman Center on Saturday, you understand what kind of an electric environment that was. This was a great atmosphere. You're competing against UCLA, obviously the heated rival that Utah's really thrived on competing against the last few years. But Utah ends the meet with a 198-1 score. That's a really high score. It's the season high for them. Great opportunity for them to beat UCLA. UCLA going into that meet was ranked 5th in the country, or 4th, excuse me. Utah was ranked 5th, and those teams have now switched. As the standings or the NQS ratings currently stand, Utah and UCLA would meet up in the Big 12 or the regionals again. But really fascinating to see how that is. So UCLA very well will likely be coming back to Salt Lake City for another meet as the teams compete for a national championship. But this is a Utah team that's really kind of hitting its stride and peaking at the right time. They had a setback the week before against Washington, but by and large, this is a team that's really kind of finding its own way. And you have a freshman in Avery Neff who has been in the all-around for the last 2 weeks again. Had a phenomenal showing at home where she almost won the all-around competition in a meet with 5 Olympians and people that were just, the tops of the game or the sport. It was really fascinating to kind of watch her and kind of the momentum that she brought to the team. And just a Utah team that really competed and did well together. So the Red Rocks will compete at the Big 12 Championships on Saturday. I'm expecting to be home from St. George at that point, and I will be reporting on that. We'll go from there, and then after that, they'll find out kind of the teams that will be in the regionals. They already know that they are in, the Salt Lake Regional because they're the ones hosting it. So you'll have another couple meets at the Huntsman Center, and we'll see kind of who they're competing against. But really fascinated, again, to kind of see their trajectory. They've been to every single nationals, so that's kind of their goal in getting there. And you don't want to be able to miss there or have a bad meet that keeps you from that. So fun times for the Red Rocks. This is a team that you can absolutely support, that absolutely has a chance to win a national championship. But there's still things that they have to do to be consistent and kind of get there. There's still things that they can improve. But the fact that they, finished the season out on a senior night, get a 198-1. Grace McCallum gets her first 10 on beam, is a great showing. That was honestly the loudest I've ever heard the Huntsman Center covering gymnastics, and it was a pretty remarkable moment for her. So great opportunity. This is a fun team to watch. Anybody that's involved in gymnastics, you understand it. It's a great opportunity. So we'll call that the end of the episode today. A lot covered there, but we'll get a little bit more nitty gritty in some of these things as we move forward, especially with football. And we'll get back into this. We've got a plan to kind of talk about all these things, especially when spring football ends, and we'll kind of get into the meat of these schedules for football and stuff like that. So obviously I'll document too what comes of Alex Jensen's staff, what kind of players he's bringing in, and we'll get into that stuff as well. So thank you for listening. I do appreciate it. I do appreciate when I hear from you and know that you do listen. It makes this much easier to want to do it every day, or not every day, but every week. So I appreciate it. Have a good day, and enjoy the snow.